Washington Journal continues.
Continuing our discussion of the Iraq effect, the author Peter Bergen is on your screen now. Mr. Bergen, in a nutshell, what was your conclusion in the Iraq effect article?
Well, we really wanted to ask the question, what has the effect of the Iraq War been on jihadist terrorism? Because there's been a lot of rhetoric around this, but not much actual real information. And we found that since the Iraq War began, a 7-fold increase in the number of jihadist terrorist attacks compared to the period between 9/11 and the invasion of Iraq in late March of 2003. And we adopted a very conservative methodology. We only looked at attacks that killed more than one person or more. We used the RAND database, which is really the best database there is out there. And we only used attacks that can be really identified to a known jihadist group with an al-Qaeda-like view of the world. We also excluded the Palestine-Israeli conflict as being not really relevant, subject to factors that are particular to that conflict.
And is it because of the Iraq War?
Well, I mean,
is it specifically because of the Iraq War? I know you did some other
I mean, obviously, you know, half of this is happening in Iraq, so that's obviously very specific to the Iraq War. There wasn't jihadist terrorism before the Iraq War. There's obviously an epidemic right now. A lot of it, of course, is in Afghanistan. But what happened in Afghanistan is the jihadists learned from Iraq. We didn't see any suicide terrorism really to speak of in 2003, 2004 in Afghanistan, 27 suicide attacks in 2005. 139 in 2006. So it's a exponentially rising graph. And then we also found significant rise in terrorist attacks around the Arab world and to some degree in Europe. There is some good news in our study. There is a 67% decline in terrorism in Southeast Asia. That's really got nothing to do with Iraq. That's got to do with some law enforcement measures that were taken in Southeast Asia. Also the fact that the al-Qaeda affiliate there has killed a lot of civilians. That's turned people off. And we also found that only 18 Americans have been killed by terrorist attacks, excluding contractors killed in Iraq and Afghanistan since the beginning of the Iraq War. But only 4 Americans were killed between 9/11 and the beginning of the Iraq War by terrorist attacks. So, that number has remained fairly constant. I don't think it's necessarily going to be hugely surprising. I think what this study does is, for the first time, lay out some of the numbers so that, Donald Rumsfeld famously complained, you may remember, we don't really have any metrics to know if we're winning or losing the war on terrorism. Well, we have a lot of terrorism figures, and these metrics don't paint a particularly positive view.
Some would argue, though, that there still have not been attacks in the U.S. These attacks would have happened anyway, but the U.S. has not had another devastating attack.
Yeah, and that's
is that a fair argument?
Well, I think there are three reasons for that. One is, of course, al-Qaeda is still weakened, although it's certainly resurgent, as I've written in the New Republic recently, as was the case in the New York Times a couple of days ago. Also, the United States government has made us safer in the United States. And Americans are very cognizant of this problem. If somebody's doing something kind of which seems suspicious, they're going to be calling that in to law enforcement. But that doesn't mean that we're off the hook. I mean, if the attack in London, where the plan was to bring 10 American airliners down with liquid explosives back in the summer of 2006, Peter, if that attack had happened, thousands of people would be dead. So it's not like the jihadists are so distracted that they're not capable of planning more anti-American attacks. We remain the main enemy. And my concern, of course, is that looking down the line is the blowback, as it's known in terrorism circles, from the Iraq War. There was blowback from the Afghan war against the Soviet Union. That was the first Trade Center attack in '93, the embassy attacks in '98, the Cole, 9/11. We've already run this particular videotape. Why would the blowback from the Iraq war look different? Those foreign fighters who are going to Iraq, not all of them are going to die there. A lot of them are going there to die. But I mean, we just had 2 stories yesterday, which I thought were quite interesting. Craig Whitlock in the Washington Post in Morocco, going to a place where there were people, being recruited to go and fight in Iraq. And Craig Smith, also in the New York Times. In his
same story, basically.
Yeah, except in Tunisia. So, it's unfortunately the Iraq War. We're not making the argument, the absurd argument, that the Iraq War is causing all this terrorism. Terrorism existed before the Iraq War. What we're saying is it amplified it.
Our guest is Peter Bergen. We're talking about the Iraq War's effect on terrorism. Moreland, Indiana, you're on the air. Go ahead.
I think the Iraq invasion and all the innocent people that have been killed there by Americans and the al-Qaeda, I think it's going to have a real long-lasting effect on how many people continue to hate the United States, rightfully or wrongfully. It will increase what our risks are for a long time. People refer to Vietnam. We were there, 12, 14 years, and when we left there, of course, there was the communists took over and all that. But what good did we do the 14 years we was there?
Mr. Bergen.
Well, I mean, as the caller indicates, I mean, we have a huge raft of polling data from around the Muslim world by the Gallup organization, by Pew, by Zogby, and it's year by year. And of course, anti-Americanism is at record heights. That's largely in part to the Iraq War, particularly in the Muslim world. You know, our numbers are effectively flatlining in many of these countries. And you know, I'm somewhat concerned about anti-Americanism. Obviously, disliking the United States doesn't make you a terrorist, but we've increased the group of people who don't like us. If a small percentage of those people decide to, do violence against us, we've clearly increased the number of people who might be inclined to terrorism, or more importantly, the sort of people who we'd want to influence to help us. I think we've alienated that group of people.
Next call comes from Dallas. Go ahead, Dallas.
Hello.
You're on the air.
Yes. Listen. I'm gonna say something to you. Listen. I'm African American and Hispanic, and what I'm about to say is this. If we're gonna fight the war in the Middle East, and we're gonna spend almost close to $100 billion, and we've almost lost about close to 4,000 troops. Listen, we know that our peace treaties are not working, and we've already confronted the President of the United States, George Bush Jr. And I just think that if you're going to go in there, you know what I'm saying, and you're gonna start talking about war, well then maybe we need to just let him go in there and fight a full war. You know, I mean, just go in there and brush it down so we can start a democracy.
You know, one thing about Iraq, which I'm personally not in favor of at all, is a complete withdrawal, because I think we're in a sort of stage where we're either going to get an F or a D minus, and so we could snatch a total catastrophe from the jaws of an enormous blunder, in my view, if we totally withdrew. Because what is the strategy of the jihadists, and what is their narrative? Their narrative is we're a paper tiger, and it's based on Beirut and Vietnam and Somalia that will pull out if you send enough body bags home. But what is their strategy? Their strategy is to basically get another Afghanistan somewhere in the middle of the Middle East, and where better than in Central and Western Iraq. So it seems to me whoever wins in the next election, Democrat or Republican, clearly the American people, I think, are very tired of this conflict. On the other hand, we have to really look at what our basic national security interests are, and having a mini Afghanistan in the heart of the Middle East, sort of a de facto jihadist state in Central and Western Iraq, that would be very damaging.
From the Iraq Effect Study, worldwide before the invasion of Iraq between 9/11 and March 2003, there were 43 jihadist attacks. Worldwide after the invasion, 688 jihadist attacks. Again, where did you get these figures? What did you use as your base?
The RAND database has been compiled since 1968. The RAND Corporation is a major entity that does research mostly for the U.S. government, for the Pentagon. This is by far the best publicly available data. And RAND is very careful about the way it compiles the data. It only adds a terrorist attack to its list if it can identify the group involved in an attack. And that's by either a preponderance of media reporting or a legitimate claim of responsibility. So that's the way, that's how, that's the basis. These figures come from RAND. We, of course, added our own analysis.
The Iraq War has also encouraged the spread of more hardline forms of jihad. Anger and frustration over Iraq has increased the popularity, especially among young militants, of the hardcore Takfiri ideology that is deeply intolerant of divergent interpretations of Islam, etc.
Takfir is a very interesting concept. Takfir is the idea that jihadists can basically decide who's a Muslim, who isn't a Muslim. They've decided that pretty much everybody isn't really a Muslim unless they agree with them. So this much more hard line, I mean, think about it, the anti-Shia attacks that are happening in Iraq. Even Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri were trying to rein that in and stop the attacks against the Shia. So this figures speak for themselves in terms of the numbers of Shias that have been killed by Sunni extremists. The Iraq War has inflamed Sunni-Shia tensions. not only in Iraq, but I think regionally. So that's another sort of side product of the war that has been very counterproductive.
Next call for Peter Bergen comes from Atlanta. Go ahead. Atlanta.
Yes. I want to say that if you go back and read George Bush's words from the time that he was campaigning, he always intended to go into Iraq. And he thinks that he's been appointed by God to bring peace to the world. And I don't care how many people, how many soldiers are killed or how many people are killed, he is not going to stop.
That's an opinion that the caller holds very strongly. I can't really...
What was the year that you interviewed Osama bin Laden?
97. In fact, it's almost 10 years ago exactly. Well, interestingly, by the way, Peter, bin Laden's going to be 50 this year. I mean, I'm 44 now, so I think at 50 has been relatively young. I mean, he's done a lot of damage. And of course, he's still out there.
You think he's still alive?
Oh, there's overwhelming evidence of that. I mean, we've had 5 audio tapes from bin Laden in the past year, many of which have contemporaneous references. We haven't heard from him for a while, which is a little puzzling because you would have thought he would have wanted to get out there on the 5th anniversary of 9/11. Ayman al-Zawahiri, his number 2, as I'm sure you know, he's on TV all the time. I mean, if I was his publicist, I'd say, enough already. You're making so many statements that aren't even really newsworthy. Certainly if bin Laden came out with an audio tape or videotape, that would be a big news.
We just had the Pakistan's ambassador to the U.S. on. Do you think there's any chance that Osama bin Laden is in Pakistan?
I admire Ambassador Durrani, and he has his job to do, and I think I didn't hear what he said to you, but I presume he said that bin Laden is not in Pakistan. No one really knows where bin Laden is, but the overwhelming consensus of the U.S. military and U.S. intelligence is that he's on the Afghan-Pakistan border, probably on the Pakistan side, quite far up in the north.
And we also talked about the training camps potentially in Pakistan.
Again, I'm a big fan of Ambassador Durrani. I'm sure he said that these training camps don't exist. In his defense, these training camps are not barracks that you can see from the air from a satellite. These are, according to U.S. military officials, compounds where 10 or 20 people are training. By the way, we don't have to rely on either Ambassador Durrani's word or my word or the words of anonymous intelligence officials. The Taliban and Al-Qaeda are releasing videotapes all the time right now showing this training. And you can see that it's not large scale, but it is happening. And we've had 58 videotapes from Al-Qaeda's affiliate production arm on the Afghan-Pakistan border this year. Much of it is showing training, much of it is showing attacks on American soldiers in Afghanistan, etc. So, I mean, this exists. And also, if it didn't exist in some fashion, it would be very puzzling. Why have suicide attacks more than quintupled in the past year in Afghanistan? Why have IED attacks doubled? Why have attacks on international forces tripled? I mean, we're seeing an epidemic of violence in Afghanistan, and some of that is to do with what is happening in Pakistan.
And what you write is that it's being exported, though, from Iraq.
Indeed. They've learned from Iraq. What's interesting is that people from the tribal areas in Pakistan have gone to Iraq. Basically, you don't need very many people to learn how to make IEDs. They brought the technology back. They brought the know-how. There's some evidence also of Arabs actually engaged in suicide operations in Afghanistan. And, what's really interesting, Peter, is the extent to which so much of this stuff is out there open source. The Taliban leadership will go on Al Jazeera. They will explain. We have give and take with our guys in Iraq. Osama bin Laden is telling us, giving us some advice. None of this is really secret. It's out there. They're stating it.
Next call for Peter Bergen comes from Jacksonville, Florida. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. Can you hear me?
You're on the air.
I'm wondering, since we're not going to fight the war in Iraq, and the reason we haven't been hit over here again is because they know if they hit us over here again, we won't pull out of Iraq. What my question is, what policy does the Democrats have for fighting them over here?
I can't really answer that because I'm not a...
Detroit.
Yes?
Go ahead.
Good morning. Mr. Bergman,
Caller, go ahead with your question or comment.
I'd like to refresh your memory. I believe that at one time in the Middle East, we supported the Shah in Iran. We supported Saddam, and in the Russian confrontation in Afghanistan, we supported Osama bin Laden. Now, for some reason or another, we have switched. We supported Saddam against Iran once the Shah was overthrown and Ayatollah took over. Can you comment to unravel this complexity that I'm seeing now?
Well, look, I guess a couple of comments. First of all, relationships between countries are not like relationships between friends. I mean, these are marriages of convenience for one reason or another. Obviously, we did support the Shah of Iran. We did support Saddam to some degree during the 80s when he was fighting Iran. On the question of did we support Osama bin Laden, I want to respond to that because I know that in some detail. This is one of these sort of folk myths that will never really die. Osama bin Laden has been anti-American since the mid-80s because of his support for Israel. He had his own money. He's the son of a billionaire. He had a lot of private money coming in from Saudi Arabia.
But if for some reason...
the Americans during the 80s when he was fighting the Soviets. The story about Osama bin Laden and the CIA is not that the CIA was helping fund and train Osama bin Laden and his gang of Arab fighters. It's that these people were flying beneath the radar screen. It was only until '96 when the CIA set up a special bin Laden unit that they began to really focus on this guy. And trained bin Laden and the Afghan Arabs fighting the Soviets, is that they didn't really know they had no idea who these people really were. The Afghan Arabs during the war against the Soviets were getting Saudi contributions. They were behaving in a rather secretive manner. And we know there's been a long laundry list of CIA problems, which there's no need to rehearse here, but funding or training Osama bin Laden is not one of them.
That's interesting, though, that the caller brings up the shifting alliances and who's on whose side, because attached to the article is this fact sheet. You know, Sunni, Shiite, anyone? Robert Dreyfus and Dave Gilson compiled it. It's in the Mother Jones article. But it talks about the fact that the Islamic Dawah Party, Nouri al-Maliki's party, is the same group that bombed the U.S. Embassy in Kuwait in 1983, and it's just all sorts of different connections.
Yeah, well, I'm not here to defend U.S. government policy over the last 3 decades in the Middle East.
Next call for Peter Bergen comes Ravenna,
Hello?
Ohio. Go ahead, Ohio.
Yeah, I think if the people wouldn't talk so much about the news media and all that stuff, because it goes across and they hear everything they're going to do. So that's where I think a lot of trouble comes in. And I support Bush 100%. He is the only one. Why didn't they get bin Laden before, where I've watched this all the time? And they could have got him too. Clinton could have.
Thank you, caller. Mr. Bergen?
One time we could have got Osama bin Laden was at the Battle of Tora Bora in December of 2001. There's overwhelming evidence that he was there, despite what President Bush said at one point during the election campaign against John Kerry, despite what Tommy Franks said in an editorial in the New York Times, that they didn't really know if he was there or not. That is completely ludicrous. Gary Bernson, who was the head of the CIA operation there, has written a book. He's, by the way, a Republican, saying that bin Laden was definitely there based on radio transmissions they were getting. So, unfortunately, the last time that we really knew where bin Laden was now, 5.5 years ago. Since then, we don't really have very good information about what he's doing. By the way, going back to the Iraq question, Al-Qaeda in Iraq is called Al-Qaeda in Iraq. It's not called something else. And one of the many, I think, indicators of Al-Qaeda's resurgence is the fact that Al-Qaeda in Iraq renamed itself Al-Qaeda in Iraq 2 years ago. Al-Qaeda in Iraq has had a disproportionate effect about what's going on in Iraq. If you look at the suicide attacks, most of those are not Iraqis. One of the things we get into in the article is the extent to which these are people from around the Middle East, Saudis, some North Africans, even people from Europe. And they are making a big effect on what's actually happening on the ground in Iraq. They got the United Nations to pull out. They sparked the civil war. And this is, it's interesting, Peter, in the Washington Post in December, a piece based on the Marines' assessment of what's going on in Anbar province. The Marines' assessment is that Anbar province is run by Al-Qaeda in Iraq. This is a huge province in western Iraq. So, unfortunately, this article that we've written and the situation in generally indicates that Al-Qaeda has drawn tremendous strength from the war in Iraq. I think they were on the ropes in 2002, and they're back.
And Taliban set to ramp up bomb attacks in the spring, NATO spokesman says.
No doubt. I mean, that happens every year in Afghanistan, but this is a make or break year for the NATO efforts in Afghanistan, for the Taliban, for Al-Qaeda. I mean, everybody understands this is a kind of a make or break year. I'm very happy the Bush administration has...
Why this year?
Well, because the Taliban did a pretty good showing last year, and now they took a tremendous beating as well. They're probably 2,000 Taliban dead. What they need to show is we're back, we took a big beating, but we have the recruits keep coming in. We need to show that Afghanistan is a place where a surge militarily, reconstruction and diplomatically can really work. And I'm heartened that the Bush administration is talking about more than $10 billion for Afghan National Army, Afghan National Police, reconstruction aid. I'm also heartened by the fact that Bob Gates, the Secretary of Defense, asking for more troops, because the situation in Afghanistan is a kind of classic glass half empty, half full. There are a lot of things that have gone right, a lot of things that have gone wrong, but the trend line is definitely down. I mentioned earlier in the program the number of ID attacks, the number of suicide attacks, the number of attacks on international forces, declining levels of confidence amongst the Afghan people. On the plus side, Afghans remain very happy about the overthrow of the Taliban. The Taliban remains very unpopular. Afghans want international forces. It's a very different picture than what we see in Iraq. You know, if you poll Iraqis, do you want the United States to pull out? 90% of them would say yes. If you poll Afghans, do you want the United States and NATO allies to stay? 90% of them would say yes, we want them to stay. We're happy about their presence. Our life is better than it was under the Taliban, but we're worried.
What's the international cooperation level in Afghanistan currently?
Oh, it's incredibly high. This was the first time that NATO in its 50-year history invoked Article 5, which is the right to collective self-defense. This was, a war that everybody could get around. Now, there is a problem, because now that NATO has taken over, which many good things about that, because now this is not even a U.S. military operation. The head of the NATO operation is a U.S. military commander, but this is, involves many, many other coalition partners. But some of these partners won't fight. The Dutch are fighting, the British are fighting, the Canadians are fighting very bravely in the south of Afghanistan. The Germans won't fight, the French won't fight, and there's already a lot of resentment. The Canadians feel like, our guys are being killed, the Germans won't come down and help us. But of course, politically, it's very difficult for some of these countries to put their guys in harm's way.
The Sunni Shiite split in Iraq, is that important in other parts of the Middle East?
Yeah, I mean, it could be. I mean, there's a lot of discussion of this, and clearly there is an emerging de facto alliance between the United States, Israel, and the Sunni states. Interestingly, Saudi, Jordan, Egypt, and they all want one thing, which is to contain Iran. If the Sunni-Shia civil war, say that 3 times very quickly, if that spreads, the Saudis are going to get involved. They've got a lot of money. And you could be looking at a larger regional conflict. By the way, there's already a Sunni-Shia civil war going on in a very low-grade way in Pakistan. It's been going on for years. Hundreds of people get killed every year in communal violence. And so if Iran is seen to be ascendant by a lot of the countries in the region, they're going to be threatened, and we're seeing some interesting realignments regionally. I mean, who would have thought that Israel, the United States, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Egypt might start suddenly kind of coming together in one common goal, which is basically to kind of, to contain Iran.
Next call for Peter Bergen is from Nacogdoches, Texas. Go ahead, Texas.
Good morning, Peter, and good morning, Peter. The unintended consequence of the warrantless wiretapping, I've been thinking that, we can't talk to people in the Middle East, and the people in the Middle East can't talk to us as far as people talking to another people. And one of the biggest things about this whole terrorism is that we don't understand each other. And but with this warrantless wiretapping, it chills every kind of communication between the two peoples.
Anything there you want to comment on?
Well, I think I'm not really sure the warrantless wiretapping has much of a kind of dampening effect on discussions between us and the Middle East. But I will say that, one thing that costs very little for us as a government to do is bringing people from the Muslim world to come on trips to the United States. And the State Department has a very good program bringing journalists, opinion makers, to come to Washington. A lot of these people have never been to the United States, come to Washington, spend 2 or 3 weeks traveling around the country, meeting people. And this, costs very little amount of money, but it engenders, I think, a tremendous amount of goodwill. What does not engender a tremendous amount of goodwill is visa policies, which exclude people from the country who I think don't really present a threat, and may I think we have to deal with people, with Islamists, people who think political Islam is the solution. That is happening around the Middle East. We saw with Hamas winning in Israel. We see this with Hezbollah in Lebanon. We see this with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And just because they have different views from us doesn't necessarily mean that we can't talk to each other. I think we need more rather than less talking.
What would be the effect if Osama bin Laden were captured or killed?
I mean, in the short term, I think it would provoke a lot of anti-Western attacks. In the medium term, it would be damaging, very damaging to what remains. Well, the ascendant Al-Qaeda organization would take a big hit. In the longer term, he'd be a martyr, a very important martyr, for the movement, the sort of Che Guevara on steroids for the Islamist movement. I don't anticipate him being captured or killed anytime soon because, it's now 5.5 years later, we don't have really any information about where he is. We have informed hypotheses about where he is, and we discussed those earlier in the program, but we don't really have real information. Ayman al-Zawahiri, the number 2 in Al-Qaeda, I think there was pretty good information. You may remember, Peter, in January of 2006, there was a missile attack in the tribal area in Pakistan, and that missed Ayman al-Zawahiri, by all accounts, by just a few hours. So the fact that Ayman al-Zawahiri is out there releasing a videotape pretty much twice a week is making him more susceptible to being captured or killed. The fact that bin Laden is being quite security conscious and releasing fewer tapes makes him a harder catch.
Was he security conscious in 1997 when you went to meet him? How long, what kind of process?
Look, this is a very paranoid and secretive person. I mean, and in fact, Ayman al-Zawahiri joined a jihadist cell when he was 15. Bin Laden started getting involved in the clandestine efforts against the Soviets when he was 20. So they've spent their entire adult lives being worried about security. So meeting him in 97, they took all sorts of precautions. So he didn't wake up on September 12th saying, I'm going to start worrying about my personal security. This has been going on for some period of time.
Next call for Peter Bergen comes from Washington, D.C. We have about 5 minutes left. Go ahead, Washington.
Yes. Hey, Peter. A couple of statements. First of all, hatred can be a two-way street. Cowards like Osama bin Laden are not in hiding because they take the hatred of the American people lightly. And also, I think it's equally dangerous for European nations to allow these fighters to come back into their countries when they go off to fight in Iraq. They should be immediately jailed and immediately dealt with. Stop the appeasement in Europe of Islamic terrorist fighters and start cracking down on these people with an iron fist so they won't be attacked again. This is a global war on terrorism, and this is nothing to be taken lightly.
Well, I mean, I agree completely. European countries whose, if they have nationals going to fight in Iraq, I mean, I'm not saying European countries are keenly aware of this problem because it's happening much more in Europe than it is. There are just a sprinkling of examples of Americans who've allegedly trained to go and fight in Iraq. There was a case in Toledo, Ohio in February of last year. But, I mean, there are quite a lot of people living in Europe who have tried to go to Iraq and have succeeded. In fact, one of the people we mentioned in the piece is an extraordinary case. A Belgian female baker's assistant, age 38, Muriel de Gork, conducted a suicide operation in Iraq in November of 2005 with her husband, who is also a Tunisian Belgian. So this is a big problem in Europe, and the Europeans are keenly aware of it. And also it could be a problem for us because clearly people who live in Europe can visit the United States easier than if let's say they have a Yemeni passport or if they have a Pakistani passport. And we saw with a plan to bring down these 10 American jets back in the summer of 2006, that people involved were all British. They're British citizens of largely of Pakistani descent. They have British passports. British citizens can visit the United States very, very easily. They don't need to go to a sit-down interview with a consular official. There's a visa waiver program, which I'm not suggesting we change, but I don't think most Americans are probably aware of this. But most Europeans can visit the country very easily without getting some sort of sit-down interview with a consular official. And of course, if we change that program, it would be much harder for Americans to visit Europe. We'd have to, there would be a tit-for-tat kind of thing. But the fact is, if we get attacked again, it's likely to be attacked by somebody holding a European passport, in my view.
Did you find in your study that countries that sent troops to Iraq were more apt to be attacked?
Yes, no doubt. I mean, the attack in London, I mean, it's one of the most reliable guide to what the jihadists will do is what Osama bin Laden says. So when he says attack members of the coalition in Iraq, and he mentions Spain specifically, 6 months later there was an attack in Madrid, killing 191 people. Bin Laden offered a truce to countries willing to pull out of Iraq. And a year after that truce expired, there was an attack in London that killed 52 London commuters back in 2005. So there was definitely a connection between, if you have troops in Iraq, these guys certainly will try and attack you. But, oh, by the way, not having troops in Iraq is no protection. You may remember, Peter, there was an attempt to blow up a train in Germany about a year ago by a group of terrorists, and that didn't work out. But Germany doesn't have troops in Iraq. And France, of course, is also in the crosshairs of these groups, and France doesn't have troops in Iraq.
Last call for Peter Bergen comes from Falls Church. Go ahead. Falls Church, Virginia.
Yes, sir. Mr. Bergman, can you talk a little bit about soft power and how the U.S. can employ it in their fight against terrorism?
Well, I think that's a brilliant question. And, you know, soft power is one of the reasons we won the Cold War. We're a lot more attractive package than the Soviet Union based on our political system, our economic system, etc. And, you know, the big weaknesses that the jihadists have, in my view, is they don't offer a positive vision of the future. If you asked Osama bin Laden on this show, what do you want? He'd say, I want the restoration of the caliphate. What does he mean by that? He means Taliban-style theocracies from Indonesia to Morocco. I think most Muslims don't want to live in. They know what the Taliban looks like. You know, Afghans hate the Taliban. They live through that. And so I don't think we can underestimate the influence of soft power. And that's why I think that some of the extraordinary renditions, some of the things that have gone on in Guantanamo, some of which have been fixed, you know, these were very damaging.
This is the article, The Iraq Effect, by Peter Bergen and Paul Cruikshank. Who is Paul Cruikshank?
Paul is a colleague of mine at the NYU Center on National Security and also a good friend.
And Sunni, Shiite, anyone? Anyone? This is the attached fact sheet, I guess you could call it, about all things Iraq. Peter Bergen has been our guest. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
And thanks for being with us on the Washington Journal. We'll see you tomorrow.
We can join together in a spirit of bipartisan unity for causes greater than self and greater than political party.
President's Week on C-SPAN 2, State of the State addresses, tonight at 8 Eastern and continuing through Friday. 38 governors delivered their State of the States. Tonight includes Virginia Governor Tim Kaine, Texas Governor Rick Perry, and Missouri Governor Matt Blunt. State of the States, tonight on C-SPAN 2. And here's what's ahead on C-SPAN. In about half an hour, we'll hear from the head of AARP on that group's legislative priorities. That's live at 10:30 Eastern. Later this afternoon, the first debate among Democratic presidential candidates. Senators Hillary Rodham Clinton, Joe Biden, and Christopher Dodd are taking part. Illinois Senator Barack Obama has chosen not to participate today. That's live at 3 Eastern. And we'll have another Road to the White House event for you tomorrow with Republican candidate Mitt Romney. The former Massachusetts governor will be in South Carolina. That's live at 7:45 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN 2 Thursday. And now an update on the CIA leak trial. It's from Washington Journal. It runs about a half an hour.